So, bonjour, hello everyone, and welcome to today's panel on how engagement can have an impact on the real economy, specifically on net zero ambitions of companies. I am very happy to see you all here and to hopefully have a lively and engaging discussion with a high-profile set of panelists. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what we're going to do. We will start with an introductory presentation from, no, not Vincent Kaufmann, the director of Ethos, because he unfortunately tested positive for COVID and is not able to be here today, so get well soon, Vincent. But we have a very worthy replacement. We have Matthias Neuer, who is head of Engagement International at Ethos and who has been with them for more than 5 years, and I appreciate Matthias a lot, especially, not only, but also especially as a source of information on LinkedIn. So if you want to get the best ESG news, follow him. So Matthias will give a presentation, and then we will start with the panel discussion with 5 experts. And first, let the experts talk, and then open up the questions also for the audience. We also have a Slido, thanks to Sébastien Dubas, who set it up, that allows people online at home to submit their questions, so they also have a chance to actively participate. My name, just briefly, I am Dorothea Bauer. I'm an independent expert and advisor on ethics, responsibility, and sustainability across industries, but specifically in finance and tech. And I have a background in business ethics. So I am very happy to now give the stage to Matthias Neuer for his introductory presentation. Thanks.
So thank you very much also from my side, from the side of Ethos, to all of you for attending this session today. We have a really wonderful panel with a variety of insights, different viewpoints. I'm looking very much forward to hear what they have to say and to discuss with them the question, what is the power of engagement to have a change, to create change, to have an impact in the real economy. So from my side, I've just prepared a few slides, a little bit to set the scene, to provide some context, and also maybe to lead over to the actual panel. I think we cannot start this discussion around impact, around sustainable investing, without taking a quick look at the numbers. I think the numbers, they're really, really impressive. We have here the numbers from Swiss Sustainable Finance, which shows that at the end of 2021, we had almost 2,000 billion in assets invested in sustainable finance strategies. And at the same time, we do have the numbers across Switzerland. So the total assets under management at the moment in Switzerland are roughly 3,300 billion. So actually, we now have a situation in Switzerland where more than half of the assets that are invested according to sustainable investment approaches. So this is really, I think, a crucial moment for the sustainable finance movement. And it's not just Switzerland where we see these kind of numbers. It's also at the European Union level. It's in the US. It's even in Asia, where we see excessive growth in sustainable finance assets. So that's what we see in the numbers. Now, when we look at the impact, so what do you think? Has sustainable investment actually delivered? I've just put here one key indicator. Is of course a macro indicator. It's not maybe specific to individual investors, but if you just look at this very crucial indicator on the environmental side, the annual emissions, we actually see, maybe not so much. I think if you're an optimist, you see more or less a flat trend across the last 4 or 5 years. If you're a pessimist, you see a rising trend. But for sure, we're not seeing a trend that is really going downwards very steeply, as it should, if you listen to the scientists. So we need to bring emissions down, and this is, of course, not happening. And I think here it's also very important to make maybe one clarifying remark. for us also from the ethos side, when we look at these things, we always have the view of double materiality. So we are an investor. We, of course, look at how do sustainability topics affect our portfolios, what kind of risks do they create, but we also look at how we can create impact. And typically, this is the impact that we want to see. We want to actually see emissions going down, and this is not happening. This, of course, forces us to take a closer look at what actually is then sustainability investing. What kind of approaches do we have? And here we have the ranking or the classification also from Swiss Sustainable Finance, from their latest study. And we see that indeed, across all these approaches, engagement is a very popular approach. Many investors use it as their approach. And when we actually look at the traditional, classic impact investing, it's very small. It's a niche. And of course, here we're talking about microfinance, private debt, these very kind of still niche topics. So the idea is, and where I think it's also something where we believe very strongly in as ethos, is to really merge these two things, to have an engagement approach, an engagement strategy, but create impact with that. And this is really the question, I think, that we want to address today in this panel. Can we achieve impact with engagement? I would hope so. This is basically our DNA. We really believe it. We have now this panel here that will share some views. They will actually outline how they do it and hopefully come to the similar conclusion. Just maybe to also provide some context, in the following slides I prepared very briefly 2 examples where I think there was actually an impact created by engagement. Of course, also these 2 examples, we can discuss them afterwards. Maybe the panel will pick them up to see if they agree or not. The first example that I want to talk about is Climate Action 100. It's a big global initiative. You've probably already heard about it. It's also been lately in the media, especially in the US. The idea of this initiative is that relatively few companies actually cause the majority of the global emissions. And the idea was then to create a systematic engagement campaign with the most CO2 intensive companies across the globe. Basically, you end up then with a group of companies, in this case 167 companies that are high emitters from sectors such as energy, building materials, chemicals, airplanes. And together, this group of companies, they actually cause 80% of the total annual emissions. We then built a coalition. All of this was coordinated by the Principles for Responsible Investment. And in this coalition, we now have more than 700 investors with a total of 68 trillion assets under management. And that's these almost 70 trillion, that's basically half of the global market caps that you have currently listed on stock exchanges. So it's a huge number of assets behind this initiative, but it's also a huge number of investors. The targets were, in my view, very simple and straightforward. The first target was to have GHG reductions targets which are in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, so basically a net zero by 2050 target, then TCFD implementation on the transparency side, and finally, you wanted to have a good governance, you wanted to have the board at the company responsible for these topics. And now, of course, because the topic today is the impact of engagement, if you take a look at the impact of this specific engagement campaign, where, by the way, Ethos has taken the lead on 3 companies out of these 167. We now see, and this is based on an independent study by Bloomberg, we now actually see that out of these initial targeted companies, out of these initial 167, we now do have 111 companies that now have such a net zero target. So they actually complied with this first goal of the initiative. What does that mean? This is just a number. There's 111 companies now with a net zero target. If we would extrapolate these net zero targets until 2030, the emissions that would actually be saved, or that will hopefully be saved, are almost 4 billion tons of CO2 every year. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the annual emissions from today of India and Japan. If you go even further and extrapolate to the end of this time frame, to 2050, when we actually have to be at net zero, when we extrapolate these net zero commitments, it actually gives us a saving of carbon of almost 10 billion. So if we look at these targets, if these 111 companies deliver on their targets, and we, of course, as investors will try to hold them to account, if they deliver, we will save almost 10 billion tons of CO2 every year, and that's roughly the current emissions of China. So in my view, that's clearly a big impact of an individual investor initiative. A second very important point, and that's also a point I'm looking forward to hear this panel speak on. Of course, usually when you engage, you start with a letter to the chairperson, then you follow up with emails, you have this dialogue, you maybe meet, you have meetings via Zoom, via Teams, you try to put your wishes to the board, and then hopefully you have a fruitful discussion and the company is open to change. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes the company doesn't listen, they do not want to listen, they have different priorities. And I think what is very important to have impact on with your engagement strategy, you have to be willing to escalate. At one point, you actually have to say, so I've tried, I've did my best, but the company doesn't listen, so I'm actually willing to intensify. And the very important role here do have to play, in our view, shareholder resolutions. And here I've just 3 examples from Ethos track record, what we have done. So initially, we started with our first shareholder resolutions were really corporate governance shareholder resolutions. So already over 20 years ago, we started to file shareholder resolutions pushing company to split the role of CEO and chairperson, which is really best practice, which is how it should be. But at that time, wasn't the case at many Swiss companies. So we started to file shareholder resolutions, for example, at Zurich Insurance, Novartis. Also interesting then to have the view on this from the Novartis side today on the panel. And what we have now, when we look at the main index here in Switzerland, the Swiss Performance Index, it's actually really a no-go. So it's less than 2% of the companies that now still have these combined chairperson, CEO roles. Whereas when we started over 20 years ago, it was still quite common with over 20% that had this configuration. The second important aspect where we've tried to raise the stakes and also create more impact was with Say on Pay. You might think Say on Pay is now really a standard. Yes, it now is a standard. It wasn't 10 years ago. So also on this matter, we filed several shareholder resolutions, for example at ABB or Swiss Re, to have this possibility as shareholders to vote on the remuneration schemes of the companies. This then also gave courage to the regulator. We are now even having a law in Switzerland that actually makes this mandatory to grant this vote to shareholders. And I think also here, it's clear, I mean, you can still argue, is 10 million too much for a CEO or not? But in terms of the averages, they have stabilized. So we now more or less have a kind of a ceiling around 10 million per annum. Which is a lot, but yeah, you can always debate. But what we're not seeing anymore is these excessive outliers. So you don't have a CEO anymore making maybe 60, 70 million a year. So this clearly has stabilized. These shareholder resolutions have, amongst other push factors, created this change. And then maybe really the newest topic where we are now very active also with shareholder resolutions is, of course, climate change, the pressing issue that we have to solve as humanity. We've put 2 shareholder resolutions for a Say on Climate to the 2 biggest emitters in Switzerland, to Nestlé and Holcim. A Say on Climate resolution actually asks the board to put their transition plan towards net zero to their shareholders. And then their shareholders can approve it or not, based on if they think it's ambitious enough or not ambitious enough. We put these 2 shareholder resolutions to the boards of Holcim and Nestlé, and both actually agreed voluntarily to do it. So we didn't even have to file the resolution. but the boards agreed to comply with this request, and now we've had the possibility this year at Holcim to vote on their transition plan, and last year on Nestlé's transition plan to give our consent or not consent as investors on this. So this creates really a powerful and successful loop with the boards of these companies on climate change. Another company where we filed a resolution, that was actually a resolution that went to a vote just this year at Credit Suisse at their AGM, we asked the company together with a group of investors to be more transparent around their financing policies, to be more open how they actually plan to achieve their own net zero target if they continue to finance oil and gas. Here, the board didn't agree, so the board said, yes, it's an important matter, but not important enough. So we will actually put this on the ballot and give investors to vote. What has happened is we were able to vote this last April on this resolution. We had 18.5% of the investors that actually were backing this request, which is quite unique because it was the first time to have such a vote at the Swiss bank. We also had to change the Articles of Association, so it was a big thing, but still we had 18.5%. We also had over 4% of the investors that abstained. So you could almost say over 20% of the investors didn't agree with Credit Suisse here. And even with this, of course, we didn't have a majority, but we had over 20%. And already this forced Credit Suisse to take a closer look at it. And what they did in the run-up to the annual general meeting, they actually already tightened their guiding, their principles that are guiding their financing policies. So they've now actually introduced more stringent financing policies for their corporate loans to Arctic drillers and also to oil sands, which is of course a huge topic, the oil sands in Canada. So this is just to show sometimes engagement maybe doesn't really yield the results that you want. That's when you actually have to be able to escalate. And with this, I don't want to take any further time. I'm really looking to hear from the panels, hear their views on these topics. Just maybe in a summary, and this is really now from a ethos perspective, what do we think is required for engagement to actually have this impact in the real economy? It's costly. You have to be ready to invest time and resources. You have to be ready to invest the hours because there's almost never a quick win. It's a long and sometimes difficult process. You have to have clear targets. This is what we have seen with Climate Action 100. The target was to have a net zero goal. That's something which is very clear. It's broadly understood. Companies are also able to embrace it. Then it's always good to build coalitions. We do this in Switzerland by bringing together the pension funds, which give us their trust to engage corporates in their name. We do it also at the international level by joining Climate Action 100 and similar initiatives, because there is strength in numbers with these kind of things. And finally, and maybe most importantly, I think you also have to be ready to escalate if an engagement doesn't go according to progress. If there's no willingness to move on the corporate side, I think it's important that you're willing to do the next step. That can be making a statement at the AGM of the company. That could be a divestment and publicly making it known that you want to divest, or ultimately filing a shareholder resolution. So with this, I'm actually at the end of my points. Again, here the QR code for the Slido. We want this session with this very interesting panel to be interactive and also to have your input. So thank you very much if you participate also on your side in this session.
So thank you very much, Matthias, for this very illustrative presentation on how ethos tackles engagement and what you have achieved so far, and that not everything is black or white. It's not either just engage or divest. There are a lot of steps in between. I'm very happy to welcome the panelists on stage now, and please join me on stage and I will introduce each of you personally. So here we are in a really nice and in many regards diverse settings, most of all in terms of roles that we have represented on that panel. We have one representative of an asset owner, we have two asset managers with different profiles, we have a representative of a very reputable corporation, and we have a PhD researcher, almost PhD now. So let me introduce, to my right is Grégoire Henny. He is kind of the asset owner on the panel. He's the CIO of the pension fund of the state of Geneva, CPEG, since 2014. Previously had a really interesting role in the same function at the pension fund of CERN, of the European Organization for Nuclear Research based in Geneva. Grégoire is also actively involved with the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, IIGCC, where he first was vice chairman of the board, and he is now a special advisor of the board. So it's quite obvious that Greg has a long-standing background in finance, but his academic background is a PhD in mathematical statistics. So he clearly cannot only talk, he can also calculate, I guess. Next to him is Claire Berthier. She is Deputy CEO of the asset management company Trust Team based in Paris, Trust Team Finance, sorry, based in Paris, where she is in charge of socially responsible investment and also of supporting functions. Previously, she worked as equity fund manager and head of socially responsible investment. She also has a background in investment banking, and she co-founded a social impact startup. Her academic background is she graduated from HEC. In the middle of the panel, we have Marc Evgen. He is representing Clarton Associés, small. They're proud to be called small. I have the official permission. A small asset management company in Switzerland, where he acts as a managing director since 2016. He is also senior advisor of the Clarton Ethos ESG Europe Small and Mid Cap Fund, which was launched 2 years ago. Marc holds a master's degree in finance, and he's also a CPA and a CFA charter holder. And he teaches corporate valuation at the HEC Lausanne, which also, as he told me, increasingly touches on questions of sustainability. So students are more interested now. Before joining Clarton, he also has an investment banking career in London. Next to him sits Anne Kellers, who conducts research about the impact of sustainable finance in public capital markets at the Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth at University of Zurich. And prior to joining University of Zurich, she worked at a private bank, and she also was an auditor for the FNG label, which certifies sustainable investment funds. She graduated from Cambridge, where she conducted a really nice study, a mystery shopping study about the sustainability capacities in German retail banks. And she told me that she has actually just submitted her PhD, so I am quite sure it's only a matter of time until we can officially call her Dr. Kellers. And to her right, seen from my side, is Samir Shah, who has been head of investor relations at Novartis since 2012, an impressive long-standing career. He is also a member of finance leadership team, and prior to being in this role, he was the head of strategy and business development and licensing, and he was also business franchise head, neuroscience and ophthalmology. So before joining Novartis, Samir worked in Geneva at Merck Serono, so he knows the place, and his background is he's a physician with postgraduate medical training, and he also holds an MBA, so he's not just about business, but he probably also understands the drugs that they are selling. So I'm very happy to have you all on stage, and I would like to start with a question to Grégoire Henny. So Greg, just you have several roles, as I said. So can you please tell us briefly about your pension fund's approach to ESG, particularly to engagement, and also let us know a bit more about your role as a special advisor to the board of the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, which, as I saw, is representing an impressive 51 trillion euro assets under management. So what role does engagement play for you at the pension fund of Canton Geneva, and what role does it play at IIGC?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. Very pleased to be here with you and to discuss about a very important topic. The CPHG's ESG strategy complies very much with the 4 asks of the European Union. The first one is to manage the temperature of your investments as well as reduce the carbon emissions. Second is engagement. Thirdly, impact investing. And lastly, reporting and transparency. Out of those 4 pillars, 2 have a concrete impact on the environment. One is engagement and the other one is impact investing. When it comes to these 2 very important topics, we must understand that it needs to be a collective effort. We have absolutely no, it leads to no results if it's just an individual knocking at the door of a corporate. It needs to be also framed within a leadership. And we think, for example, Ethos or the IIGCC needs to lead those efforts for different reasons. The first one is we need to engage with and set up objectives. So we need to, for example, set up a benchmark for the sector that we're engaging with. And we need to also set up objectives and targets. There are technical issues when we're asking a corporate to put itself in a transition and come up with a proper strategy and transition strategy. There are technical issues that as a pension fund we cannot address. So this is a very important thing, and I value the collaboration that we have today with Ethos and the IGCC and also other initiatives that were mentioned in the previous presentation. To come back to your question, how do we address engagement? There are different levels of engagement that investors can embrace. The first one is simply join those groups and initiatives and fund them and help them to engage resources for this activity. The second level is to be a bit more active and to sign initiatives and demands. The third level is to be an active shareholder, participate to the AGM's deposit demands, resolutions, and so on. And the last level is to be on the ground and within the framework and the leadership to engage directly with corporates. CPHG has decided to develop its strategy and be active within the 4 pillars. And within CPHG, what is important is to bring the Swiss perspective. More importantly for CPHG is to share the values of the pension fund, but more importantly to convey the Swiss perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. So I see it's like a ladder of different engagement levels and kind of goes hand in hand what you're doing at the level of the asset owner and the level of IIGC. So Claire, also you're not just one-dimensional, you have several roles. On the one hand, the Deputy CEO of Trust Team, the asset manager. On the other hand, you're heavily involved in what we heard from Matthias also on the Climate Action 100+ initiative, which is actually the world's largest investor engagement initiative on climate change. And in fact, I researched that IIGC, where Greg is involved, is one of the main coordinators of Climate Action 100+. So it's all sounds like a family to me. But also from you, I would like to know how you differentiate what role engagement plays in the context as an asset manager and within your activities with Climate Action 100+.
So thank you, because I'm very happy to be here, because what I heard just before was really related to our previous discussion. And I think, when I told you first, I think we are at a tipping point. And here, what you just said really resonates with what we are doing and what I see that could have happened in the next years. So to answer your question, first, what is an asset manager? It's someone that invests the saving of the customer into companies, briefly. And what you do by that is that you have to build trust on the one side with your customer and on the other side with corporates, which means that you build this relationship, that you engage with them on a daily basis. And 20 years ago, you were doing that on only the financial side. Now you're doing it on the extra financial side, and more now on the climate and the real impact on the real economy. So it's really that's something you try to do. And by building for years relationship with corporates, now you can give them the best practices, or try to orient them on the right way. We have done it, as I told you, for years on the financial side, then on what we know our core investment strategy, which is on customer satisfaction. But then arrive some years ago the urgent need on climate. And yes, on that, you cannot be alone. So why joining the Climate Action 100+ was really just not to be alone and to share knowledge, because you cannot be knowledgeable on all. And to have impact on the most important producer of CO2, you know that you can move the needle all together and work for the greater good. But again, not alone. So that's really something that was very important for us. So in the various roles, yes, as asset manager or then CEO of an asset management company, what you do on engagement is really to help to find the right company in which to invest and to build trust and also proudness in your customers so that they could be satisfied and proud of you, even in the hard times that we have now on the market. And really, it's great for a CEO to have feedback from customers when they tell you, you know, I see the performance, yeah, it is what it is, but after that, I know why I am invested in you and why I'm invested, where my money goes. And I'm proud of it because I know that I can have in my savings for something. So that's the first thing. And then on the other side, it's on the climate action, what we do is that you need, as you cannot be knowledgeable for everything, you have to focus on certain areas. So what is great in this coalition, I think, is that, for example, in France, you have to have this culture with the CEO and know how to speak to them. And it won't be the same in Switzerland. So I cannot lead, it would be hard to lead, to be a leader on Switzerland, on a Swiss company. So what I do is first being a leader on lead for some French companies, then organize the French working group, because between French investors and French companies is good. And then also to co-chairing some working groups, very specialized things like Paris-aligned accounts, on how you can relate the financial and the extra-financial side, and really, you know, move the needle, because in what has been what we ask to companies inside the benchmark, inside the net zero, it was first to commit themselves to net zero, but now we go deeper and we ask for money, for CapEx plan, for transition, and so now, yeah, we move to the real economy.
Okay, thanks a lot, Claire. And I really, maybe I can pick up that later. I know from our prepared call that Claire puts emphasis on the fact that engagement is also very much a political, strategic, cultural endeavor. It's not just about numbers. And I could hear that in your answer already. It's about, you know, trust and also being proud of you know, what you're doing for your clients. So I might get back to that. But I want to move to Samir now, who, as I said, represents like the corporate perspective, or like represents Novartis. So, as the head of investor relations at Novartis, I imagine that you must be a very busy guy because engagement is on the rise. So your phone must be ringing all day long, I can imagine. But I would like to know from you what makes engagement worthwhile for you as a company. What does Novartis gain from it other than being harassed by phone calls? And how does engagement really impact your ESG activities, not only, but in particular also with regards to emissions?
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the organizers for inviting Novartis and myself to this particular panel. I think you're being very kind when you say I must be very busy. Actually, you're all probably busier, and certainly my team is busier than I am. So they're the ones who are actually addressing all the questions which we're getting from investors. If we think about engagement, perhaps what I wanted to talk about is what our definition of engagement is, then why we do it, how we do it, and what Novartis may gain from engagement itself. So our definition of engagement, if you look at what engagement means, and in the literal sense, it's not actually getting the ring, although that's a part of engagement, but it's very similar, which is that we're actually trying to build communications and loyal bridges with our current and future shareholders and also stakeholders. And hence, this particular conference, Building Bridges, is very aptly named as we think about engagement. So that's what we define as engagement. Then in terms of why we do it, well, investor relations actually is a two-way communications process. What people are familiar with is that, as Claire alluded to, we do provide, at least on a quarterly basis, information about the company's performance from a strategic, operational, financial, and especially now ESG performance to our stakeholders, in particular to the shareholders. But what's equally important for us is the other flow of communications, i.e. from our shareholders and from other stakeholders, your information which is provided back to our senior management and the board. That's a key part of the investor relations function. And therefore, engagement is important. How do we actually do it? It's, I think, as Matthias alluded to in his presentation, of course, we do phone calls. Of course, we do communications via email, etc. But far, far more important is the face-to-face communication. You gain a lot more from that. And if you use the same analogy again, you can get engaged, or you can meet somebody on a web, and you can talk to them through a phone call. But if you really want to get engaged with them and put that ring on, you've got to meet them in person. It's exactly the same here as well. You have to meet your shareholders. And then, in terms of what do we actually gain from it, it's especially important if you think about the 4 areas which we communicate with each other on. That's strategic, financial, operation. It's even more important from an ESG perspective. And the reason why engagement is more important from an ESG perspective is there's asymmetry between different industries and different companies in terms of the material ESG factors. And secondly, there's inconsistent information sources. And therefore, by having that engagement, you clarify what's important to a company, and you also get a clarification from your shareholders as to what's important for them. So that's one aspect for why engagement is so important. Another aspect, which I think Greg and Claire have already alluded to, is the learnings that we get and the emerging trends. You know, being in a company, you only see the world in your own way and the way it's defined internally. You have the benefit of going across all industries, all companies, and you see best practices. It's a fantastic function which shareholders do, as well as proxy advisors such as Ethos, because you bring to our attention what are the best practices, what are the emerging trends. Even ESG, when I first started at the end of 2012, was not so important for Novartis. It's clearly a trend which became very important. So that's one aspect. Then if you think about climate, TCFD is becoming important. You also think about the way you've explained to us how you look at impact. And you say, you know, when you give out information, you're talking about input and output. But what you really need to focus on is outcome and impact as a result of the outcome. And that's why we need to engage. And the other reason is for us to work out our material ESG factors by definition, we need to talk to all our stakeholders, in particular the shareholders. And the final point which I wanted to say is in how we actually do it is we've reorganized our investor relations group, whereby in the past we used to have 3 managers in Basel who used to talk about strategic, operational and financial performance. Now we have 2 managers who also talk predominantly about ESG. And one of them is sitting here, Mavic, who's actually here.
So thanks a lot, Samir. That really also tells us, the value of engagement being also in the talks to give meaning to the data, which is not always speaking for itself. So even though we have more and more data, it always needs to be contextualized. And so I think that's why engagement as a complement to the purely analytical, calculations is really important, as you emphasize it. I would now like to move on to Merck, who represents Clerton, as I said, and who has launched a fund with Ethos 2 years ago. And we've heard from, those giants, like Novartis is a giant, IIGC is a giant, Climate Action 100 Plus is a giant. So let's focus briefly on your fund, which is distinctive. It's composed differently. What is the role of ESG in that fund, and how does engagement play into it?
Yeah, thank you for having me, firstly. And we launched the fund with Ethos 2 years ago, where it is a partnership, and Ethos is doing all the ESG analysis, the positive impact analysis, and they filter out this huge investment universe that we have, which are companies with market caps below 20 billion. To give you a feeling of the impact of this filter, this reduces the investment universe by 70%, which seems huge, but which shows you also all the way that we have in front of us in terms of engagement, in terms of bringing these companies, which are not yet investable, into becoming investable. And therefore, part of the job that we do is engaging with these companies to lead them to improve their practices. And the interesting thing is that we are talking to companies with a market cap from 150 million to 20 billion, but there's no difference between these 2 extremes in terms of reception, meaning that all the companies that we engage, they're very open-minded and they're just looking for some help, actually. And I would say that some of them, we are coaching them to lead them to better practices. And it's quite rewarding as well, because there are tons of companies around, especially in the small and mid-cap environment, which are doing great things, circular economy, recycling, and so on, but they do the right thing, but they don't know how to show that they are doing the right thing in numbers. And this is a big part of our engagement. And over last year, with Ethos, jointly, we have conducted 52 engagements, which is almost 1 engagement per week. And this goes from face-to-face meetings, which are very key, really key, to letters like Matthias mentioned.
Well, that's really interesting, complementing perspective, because oftentimes we talk about the giants in engagement, and it shows how engagement really can be also a coaching exercise, and also helping companies to transform and to exhaust their potential that they wouldn't have without being called by you. So now let's move on to Anne. I on purpose took her as the last panelist for this initial questions, because I think she has a different kind of insight, probably the deepest and most methodical insight across companies and industries from doing so much research on it. So can you please, because now I really want to know, tell us a bit about the academic evidence on the impact of ESG engagement on the real economy? I mean, because we saw something from Matthias, but I mean, you know, causation, correlation, big issues. So what do you observe there, and what are the biggest challenges in this context?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, I think we can mirror a lot what has been said here. So for example, factors as size and collaboration really matter, but also the quality of engagement. The challenge with a lot of academic studies, though, is that they focus on what's easy to measure. So that's, for example, like an agreement to climate disclosure. And when we're talking about something like net zero, it's like it requires strategic changes. It's more complex. And it's also likely that more factors than just the investor engagement has an effect on the company's decision making. So you also need to consider like ecosystem effects. So for example, what are peer companies doing? What are employees asking for? What are customers asking for? What's the regulatory landscape? And that makes these studies a lot more complicated. And so we have less evidence for topics such as net zero than like easier to like study aspects as, for example, climate disclosure. And I think that's a good question to pass on to you then. So when you receive these like complex questions that are really ambitious on like going net zero, reducing emissions, how do you differentiate which like investor is actually serious about it and which requests also to take serious and which engagement requests you're able to ignore, for example? Like how do you differentiate between the quality of engagement?
Great question. So the first point is, as a company, we do what's termed key account management, which means we pay the greatest attention to our largest current shareholder. So if our largest current shareholder comes up to us and says, look, we think it's really important that you use science-based targets for your net zero, we will obviously pay attention. And the reason for that, and the reason why engagement is so important, is because, remember, it's a two-way function. We have to give information back to our senior management in our board. And guess what? The board really cares about votes at the annual general meeting. So, to answer your question simply, how do we do it? We look at the largest current shareholders. That's the first point. The second aspect in terms of where we look at it is we also think in terms of where the proxy advisor may be. Ethos is obviously a very important proxy advisor, particularly here in Switzerland. And Ethos is extremely well researched on ESG related criteria. So we know that when they say something, they've actually researched it really well, and therefore we pay attention to it. Occasionally, you do get predominantly retail-related investors who will come to us, often with a viewpoint. Sometimes it's emotional. And when it's like that, what we tend to do is we respond back to them. We're actually very serious in the way we actually respond to them, but we would not pass that on to senior management and the board.
I would like to challenge this a bit. So, for example, if you have an investor that's really large, but for example, they say, okay, we're a passive investor, so you would know they, for example, wouldn't divest. And you also know that they say, oh, we don't vote. Like, we're really serious about like talking to you, the kind of engagement behind closed doors, but you know they wouldn't divest and they wouldn't vote. Would you still engage in this dialogue and pass on their requests to the board and kind of implement what they're asking for if they're a really large investor?
Yes. The simple answer is yes, because we do a board report at least once a quarter, and then we have interactions with members of the board, and they want to know what our investors are actually thinking. So that's the first thing. The second point is, if a large investor tells us something, I mean, I give you the example of the classic BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. supposedly they're passive, but you don't actually know how they're going to vote at the AGM. They always hold that threat. It's not because of the threat that we actually do it, but the threat is important, right? So it's that balance. You need to have some degree of tension in order for a company to take things on properly. And on that particular point, I think most of you will have probably read the Economist article and their editorial from the weekend. And they were talking about, can companies help the planet? And the article was actually entitled, All Talk, No Trousers. But they finished their editorial with a very nice comment, which is, companies can help the planet, but only if it's good for the business. And I think that's very relevant here in terms of the question which you're actually asking is, if shareholders can state why what they're asking for is going to be good for the company, then we're much more likely to do it.
Well, that's a really important point, and also thanks, Anne, for playing the challenger role here. I really appreciate that. But I want to pick up, because what you're addressing now, I must say I haven't read The Economist from last weekend yet, but I hear what you're saying. So it's about materiality. So you are asking for, basically for investors, like engagement requests that focus on what is material for you. But so how do you address materiality in your engagement strategy, for example, Claire? Because there are also standards that emphasize that, you know, you should not just focus on what is material for the company, but also on like the inside-out perspective, how does a company impact the environment? So how do you balance this? Because then, as I mean, being provocative here, Samir says he cares. That's not. I don't want to insinuate anything, but he cares mostly about, you know, what is relevant for them, and not the other way around. So how do you deal with that?
So I think that when it comes to climate, especially because here we were speaking a lot about climate, so materiality is quite easy. I mean, you just have to turn to the CO2 price, for example. And there are various ways of doing stress tests and sensitivity analysis, and it has been already like defined in the EFRA consultation this year. I mean, you really have a kind of way of doing it and how to say it is material or not. Because if you go already to a 1.5 scenario, if you go with a CO2 term that is 500, 600 euro, it's hard to say, no, it's not material. When you say what happened, you know, during the summer with drought, etc., you say, oh, it's hard to say it's not material because it's disrupting all the supply chains. When you see that for more than, we do surveys with customers and customers of the company we invest in. When you say that for 80%, more than 80% of the customer, it is very important and that company are not doing enough and that they do distrust the company because of that. There's a real risk for the company not acting. So I think that for me, on this theme, materiality is quite easy to push.
Okay, so I hear that, or I guess that at least for, yeah, as you say, that materiality is either a win-win or a lose-lose, like climate is either, yeah, win-win or lose-lose. But how does materiality come into play when you talk to small or mid companies? What is their notion? Am I right in assuming that the dominant aspect first is like how you know environmental issues impact them, like the outside-in perspective, Mark? Or
well, both ways actually, but what we see is also that lots of these companies, the smaller companies, what they are looking for is funding to develop their business, and with today's inflows into ESG investment types, it means also that if you don't have a proper ESG rating, you get cut from these inflows, and therefore you get cut from your development. So therefore, we don't it's less with smaller companies, it's less about votes, it's more about getting to the point where you get investable, and therefore it is the combination of quantitative but also qualitative approach. Face-to-face meetings. We had one of the companies in which we invested. I just wanted to give you an example, a clear example there. It's recycling steel dust. It's a world leader in steel dust recycling, and they recycle it, and it produces zinc. They sell the zinc. Okay? If you look at the scope 1 and 2, it's awful. It's awful because, why? Because obviously it's very intensive in terms of CO2 emissions. Talking with the management, saying, okay, we have an issue here in terms of CO2 emissions. It's awful, we cannot invest. They open up a bit the book and say, okay, look at scope 3, even scope 4, because at the end of the day, if you don't recycle, it's making the world not better, clearly not, but also get one step further. All the zinc that you produce, if you don't produce it by recycling steel dust, you have to extract it. And this is 8 times more CO2 intensive. And therefore, you have to not just look at the CO2 emissions, scope 1 and 2, but go the extra step. And this you can only do from the ground, from talking with the companies, and at the end of the day, getting the company to improve their reporting as well.
Again, that's so much emphasizing, like giving context to data, scope 1, 2, 3, but what does it mean, where does it happen? So Claire and Greg wanted to follow up on you, so let me have Greg talk first and then go back to Claire.
I actually have another question. The last 18 months have been extremely successful for engagement. We had concrete results. My worry is an explosion of initiatives. Because of the success of engagement, we see CA 100+, we see Nature Action 100+, we see Water Action 100+, and so on. And I think this is distracting investors' attention because we should have a one-stop shop that would embrace all those different initiatives instead of having them popping up, and we cannot be members of all of them. But I realize that we need to also embrace other dimensions. And Claire said rightly before, we were just today focusing on climate, but there are other dimensions with the E, S, and G. So my question is to Samir. Sorry, the pressure is on your shoulders. How do you reconcile engagement efforts on the E, S, and G, plus those popping up initiatives with the CA, Nature Action, and so on? And you know, those initiatives have very big stakeholders behind them. So how do you reconcile all that?
Great question. So I go back to the key point, which is focus, because you have to focus. And we did a capital markets event about 10 days ago in Basel, and the key theme was all about focus. And here, from an E, S, and G perspective, if you look at the number of factors and dimensions, there's probably 100 from an E, S, and G perspective, which we could address, but we don't. We really do focus on our key material factors. And that's, you know, health and safety, patient access, governance, those sorts of topics. That said, one area which was not considered material from a pharmaceutical company perspective, we still address, which is climate. And I'll explain why climate is so important. I don't know whether any of you have read the book by Kim Stanley Robinson called Ministry of the Future. It's a fantastic read. It's actually set partly in Switzerland. And it deals with the world in 20 to 30 years' time. And I recommend reading it because it tells you all the things which went wrong around this time, okay, in this era. And why it relates to your question again is we have to be very mindful out of the 100 requests we get, not just to focus on what we perceive to be the most material. We also had to make a judgment call on something as important as climate, because climate is probably the most existential threat there is. That's the first point. The second point is with respect to climate, and you get that feeling from the Ministry of the Future when you read it, is it's easy to fiddle the numbers. It's very easy for us to go and say, oh yeah, we're going to be net zero. And I think I saw the research which Matthias put up with all these companies saying, oh yeah, we're going to be going towards net zero. I can tell you, from my perspective, from our company, it's easy for us to come out with a press release and say, we're going to net zero in 2040, and we're going to use science-based targets. The proof and what really makes a difference is how we do it and can we actually do it. And that's why that book brought to light the fact that everybody promised all of those things, and each country then published reports in terms of how their CO2 emissions were reduced year on year on year on. Yet, for the planet, CO2 continued to increase. So there's something which is going wrong. And why I mentioned that is also relates back to your questions and your point also about the smaller companies. Because there's something fundamental which, if it's right, everybody needs to do. You can't just let the largest companies focus on reducing the emissions, i.e. the companies which make the most emissions, which are the oil, the energy companies. Even though the pharmaceutical companies are responsible for less than 1%, it's as important for pharma companies to reduce those emissions because it's the most existential threat other than potential nuclear threat, which we may now have. And I think it's important because then you show unity, then everybody obeys the same rules and the same regulations, right? And that's so important because if you think about it, we live in a society, we live with everybody else, and you have some common laws which we all follow. Thou shalt not kill in every religion matters. It doesn't matter whether you're a tiny religion like I am, with my religion, which is only 4 or 5 million in the world, or whether you're a huge religion like the Christians or the Muslims, they all follow it. It's exactly the same with respect to emissions.
Well, thanks a lot. We definitely also will have to read The Ministry of the Future. Sounds like a title from like George Orwell.
Exactly.
Is it?
Exactly. It's actually George Orwell when he wrote 1984 in 1948. Everybody read it. They were afraid of totalitarianism, science fiction, but it's the same way around. This time it's related to carbon emissions, and it's frightening, but it's got a good ending. That's all I'll say at the end, including some of the stuff which the panelists may be interested in, apart from carbon pricing, the carbon coin, all sorts of other ideas, and what central banks can do to help.
Well, it's been like a passionate plea, but at the same time a bit chilling, because I'm a bit afraid of reading it, but if you recommend it, I will take a look at it. So before I also want to open up questions for the audience, maybe any other points you would like to make on what we have discussed so far? I mean, I would have a question to Anne still, because if I may, in one of your publications you claimed, I mean, not as bluntly as I put it now, but you basically said divestment is sometimes more effective than engagement. And I know it sounds very binary, dichotomous, but what made you say that, and how would you define those cases?
Yeah. I'm not a fan of the either or perspective, so I don't think it's good to say divestment is more effective than engagement or engagement is more effective than divestment. I think rather they complement each other. But how kind of this claim came about was that we actually ask a lot of companies, under what conditions do you implement an investor request? You receive all these requests, you just from like a resource perspective, can't answer all of them. So what is the crucial point when you talk about something like net zero, where it requires a lot of investment, that you say, okay, we're going to do this, or we just ignore the request? Or it doesn't necessarily need to be ignoring, but it can be, yeah, this is like of high priority to us, we're going to look into it, we're going to make a public commitment, but nothing is really happening. And a decisive factor seemed to be that companies are analyzing how committed is the investor to the request they're raising. So, for example, if the company doesn't do anything, would the investor be willing to escalate? So, for example, would they be willing to divest? And this seems to play like a crucial role in companies' decision to say, okay, we ignore this request, or we're going to do something about it. And I think this really shows that you can't do engagement well if you're not willing to also draw consequences and to stand up for what you're asking for. And it also means that engagement can't be disconnected from capital allocation.
Yeah, that's definitely an important point, which I also, just checking the time here. So yeah, just want to just briefly go back to Greg, because do you have a specific stewardship team at the Caisse de Pension, and how does it interact with portfolio management? I mean, how is it integrated, your like ESG engagement, with what the analysts do, or capital?
Well, that's a good question. The whole investment team has to incorporate ESG constraint within their own activity. However, we have just hired someone that really takes care of ESG matters. So this is an activity that has always been important for CPG, and we continue to increase this. We feel we have this fiduciary responsibility.
Okay, great. So you're definitely not anticipating, but now implementing those requests from academia. And I see there are a lot of questions coming in from cyberspace. But first I want to see whether there's any question in the room to the panelists. So first come, first serve. Sir, can you maybe speak up, or do we have a microphone? Great, thanks.
It does work. So BlackRock announced pretty loud that they want to be a leader in climate engagement, and now I think recently came this report out that they didn't vote on the most aggressive engagement initiatives. Maybe a question to Ms. Kellers from the research side: were these initiatives really that aggressive, or did BlackRock not walk their talk?
What would you say?
I don't know. That's why I came here. No, it's hard to judge. I mean, I think you have to judge it individually. Maybe also Mr. Shah from Novartis. Do you face this often, these initiatives that are just too aggressive?
Is it okay if I answer on BlackRock? So I think BlackRock's a fascinating case, because there was some former employees from BlackRock who were ESG experts and head of their sustainability team, left and very critical, because I think what they were saying was BlackRock was not really walking the talk. That's the first thing. I think the CEO is like a celebrity in the CIO world, in the financial world, the CEO and chairman. And he wrote to every single company because he owns so much of all the companies. But by doing something like that, he's got himself into a problem, and BlackRock into a problem. Because I think you probably know that there are two lawsuits against BlackRock in the US, one from the New York district and one from one of the, I think it's Texas. And they're both for exactly opposite situations. So New York is saying he's not doing enough because he's not actually escalating and divesting companies which are polluting the world and causing too much carbon emissions. And another one from Texas, who basically have a lawsuit against him simply because they say he's interfering too much, because he's trying to interfere with what companies strategy and focus should be. So he can't win either way. And unfortunately, this shows us where the world is today, where you've got the believers and the non-believers. And coming back to your question, I can tell you that when we talk to investors in Europe, universally, they're asking us to go to the net zero with science-based targeting. When we talk to some of our top investors in the US, they categorically tell myself and members of the board, forget ESG. So that's the sort of dilemma which we face.
I mean, I think that's one of the most unfortunate developments, having ESG becoming part of the culture war in the US, and I really hope that's one of the trends that doesn't come to Europe. Personally, I wouldn't miss it. Just, you wanted to follow up, Anne, on that? And then.
So I think the major problem with these is it's a signaling problem. Like whatever an investor is doing, they're not just communicating to their own clients about their ESG strategy, they're also sending a signal to the companies. And another BlackRock example in this case is an article from The Guardian at the beginning of the year where emails became public between like BlackRock employees and an oil and gas regulator in Texas, where the oil and gas regulator was expressing their relief that BlackRock and the regulator are still on the same page with oil and gas investments. And if that's the impression that companies get, then all the engagement is just talking. They're going to sit together, they're going to write down, okay, we talked about this, they're going to communicate to external stakeholders that's on the agenda, but nothing is actually happening. And if investors actually want that company to change, then they need to like send the signal and say that they're serious about it and also show this with their actions. And that's why I think like this kind of behavior is a problem.
Yeah, Claire.
And on that really, that's why the IGCC strategy on lead investor has been, I think, so clever, because there's not only one lead for one company. Last year began to implement the fact that there would be many leads, and they have segmented the leads. So for each company, normally, you should have one big, one local, one vocal. Because in many geographies, I'm in France, so I know it very well, big cannot speak. So it's very hard for them to express really things. So you need a vocal, you need a local to get the access, you need the cultural perception and translation of what is happening, the stakeholder you have to put pressure on, the tension, the media, you said, of course, it's a tension things, and it's really about perception, and moving perception is very important. So size in the coalitions are important, so that's why the bigs are here. That's why maybe why, for example, BlackRock is involved in such coalition. And that's great, because it gives the size and the trillions we need. But after that, we need also other investors to get up, to be vocal, to send a signal, and to be clear on that signal too. So complementary.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Greg wanted to follow up.
Yeah, because this question is I think important, and going forward, those type of situation will arise. I think if you combine BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, in some cases they own 20 to 30% of corporates, and their voting right is so important. They claim that they are investors and not activists, and they're right. We have to realize that in some regions, engaging is so much more difficult than in Europe, because in Europe, I mean, the debate is so much more advanced. We have regulation in place, the governments are pushing for changes and so on. That's not necessarily the case in the US. I think we have the end of the spectrum in the US. We have super sophisticated activists, and then on the other side, we have shareholders that think that this is totally, as Samir said, detrimental to their business. I think BlackRock has to tackle those different regions and manage them differently. It may give an image that is detrimental to what they're trying to achieve, but at the IGCC, I see them on the ground. I see them engaging with corporates. and they have concrete results. In the US, it's a bit more disappointing, but we have to bear in mind that shareholders have a different mindset. Now, just to finish, I'd like to say that the laws, the regulation protects corporates in the US. Recently, some activists were threatened because they say you have to, there are filings involved and you cannot just engage with us. So I'm suing you personally. And this is a big threat for activists because are you going to be challenged by Exxon's, for example, lawyers? I mean, you have no chance. So this is a game changer, and that's why your question is important, is that engagement has to adapt to those type of situations going forward.
Yeah, well, that's also opening up another perspective. Like, if you know the law system comes into play, and then I don't know, all the talk kind of can lose its sharpness, I guess. But I see on Slido that we have one question that got like the highest number of upvotes. So let's take this question because it's interesting. It asks like, what accountability mechanisms exist for companies that don't meet targets, especially when the leadership that set these goals will be long gone by then? So, you know, responsibility, over time, etc. Is there anything that you know about such mechanisms?
I think that what is very interesting is something that you experienced here in Switzerland. It's on climate. Because in escalation, in terms of voting, it is, you know, we have a season in investing, and it's not about the winter or the fall. It's about the season of proxy voting, and so the season, you know, there's a climax arriving at March, April, and when there's a lot of resolution, etc. And yes, it's called accountability that in the end is in the proxy voting, in the remuneration, in the director vote for or against. And it has been also something that ethos, we discussed a lot with Matthias, on what is important for the board. We was discussing about Say on Climate, so which is a sandpaper for climate, and I was talking about accountability, great things, greater good. It told me yes, but it gives also the opportunity to the shareholder to materialize the opposition, especially on environment, and not to vote against the chairman or a director because of this reason. That could be mixed with other reasons. So it's really directed directly on targets, accountability, net zero. And what will happen is that it's a first measure, and then you vote against the chairman, you vote against the remuneration, and that is something that management definitely hear, I think.
Yeah,
Samir, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good point because it's the difference between short term and long term. And unfortunately, I think incentives have to play a part. And you have to think about how you can incentivize for the long term. So if you think about ESG and regulations which are likely to come into force, at least in Europe by 2024, we've been asked to look at limited assurance for our suppliers. And that's a massive, massive task because we have 45,000 suppliers. To get our suppliers to do scopes 1 and 2 is okay-ish. To do scope 3 for the suppliers is really hard. But that's just one part in terms of how you measure. But just because we do scope 3 and we report our numbers, that's not necessarily going to solve the situation. Because I go back to the Economist quote. And perhaps if I had to talk about how I would change the quote, it'll be companies can help the planet, but only if it's good for business in both the short term and managers are incentivized for the long term. And that's the criteria which I think will help. And it's not just companies, because, you know, companies are responsible perhaps, so these are the public companies where you have an opportunity to vote for, let's say, 30 to 50% of the emissions. The other 50 to 70% of emissions are from government-related organization or nationalized companies. And we need to also think of a way in which they can be also influenced. Just as a thought.
No, I like the differentiation between short term and long term. Also, from the economist's quote, like extending it to the long term. And also, because before we go into the final round, I just want to take one more question that I see on Slido, because I find it interesting. So we are hearing mostly about positive examples, and it's going forward, etc. Also being self-critical here, of course. But apparently, someone says 134 climate 100 plus companies that were examined, out of those, 98% did not provide sufficient evidence that their financial statements include the impacts of climate-related matters. Claire, I guess, since you are the most active in that initiative?
Yes. First, but let's keep in mind that first this report is released now, but on the numbers of the beginning of the year. So since then, we have been a whole year of engagement, which is not reflected in the results. So definitely about that. And I think we do some statement or go with that. But it's the beginning. Okay. But we know where we are, and that's now how we relate. And what we have to do is to speak with the company, to engage with them, to see, directly in the account where the risks are. And so that's the beginning of the journey and the dialogue. Mm-hmm. So let's work now.
Okay, it's good to hear from someone who is involved there, like what might be the problem. So Mark, but yes?
Coming back to what Claire said, I think there's also a problem with data, available data, and companies, you cannot switch from one to the other within a click, although we should do that, but it takes time. And if they are willing to change, it will change, but the fact that they did the first step is already huge.
Okay, so I see the countdown is running. We have roughly 3 minutes left, and I want to make sure that each of you has a chance to really kind of summarize or say, what did you learn in this panel? What surprised you? What are you taking home with you for your work when it comes to engagement? And maybe I can start with Greg again.
Well, I was very pleased to have this fruitful discussion today. I think it's again about, we have different perspective on how we should engage with other constraints. I think, first of all, it helps to broaden the industry and the network, and I think it's all about network. I think we have to continue to work together. It needs to be a collegial effort. Engagement is a major pillar with the fight against climate, and I think this is what I'm going to take back as to there are a few initiatives here that were debated on, and we need to grow the community. That's my takeaway.
Thanks, Greg. Claire, just briefly, because time is running.
I could not be more agree on the networking work together. And maybe an additional word on leadership, you mentioned it, and just being aware that we are on an adaptive challenge on leadership and not a technical one. So data are great, but it's only a beginning.
Mark?
It's always tough to be after two good conclusions, but it gives me a lot of hope, because we're all in the same boat at the end of the day. And let's not forget that the ultimate owner of these companies, all of us. It's not BlackRock, it's not Claire, it's not me, it's all of us. We are the owner of the companies, and as an owner, you have to stand your man.
Thank you. Anne?
With most discussions, I see that there's a lot of consensus that both investors want to do a lot and also companies want to do a lot, so the ambitions are definitely there. But I would say the devil is in the detail. So when you come to a situation of conflict that a company says, no, that's not something we can do, or the investor is kind of like, okay, what are we going to do now? Then it's really important to pay attention to what are they doing? So when are investors willing to escalate? What are companies actually willing to comply to? What are they doing? I think that's what really matters, and that's also where we should focus our questions going forward.
Okay, thanks. Samir.
Just very briefly, I think this has been an amazing example of engagement between ourselves and the audience and who you've got on the web. That's the first point. The second thing is engagement's so important. We all have a common goal, and we all need to work together. And that's what we've seen, because we see the common goal between us, and we see we're trying to work together.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I took away a lot also from preparatory calls, and I thank everyone for making it here today. You have definitely enriched my perspective on engagement. I hope also the audience. And we're coming to an end now. I am told that I should inform you that there is a lunch break now. Don't miss it. It's 1.5 hours. And the next sessions will be starting accordingly at 2 o'clock. So thanks for joining us and have a nice day. Bye-bye.